Hello, students. We are here again for yet another session on live session on the issues of environment and science. This would be a topic for this session. The topic for today is related to. Just give me a moment. The topic is related to water stress in India, and particularly, I'm going to talk about the latest report of WWF, which talks about the water crisis, emerging water stress across the world. The name of the report is High Cost of Cheap Water, and the entire discussion will be routed around that report only. I will be mostly talking about the findings of the report. I will be talking about how WWF has presented their idea. They have put up their case on the emerging water crisis, and in the passage I'll be taking examples of India's water crisis. I'll be taking examples or issues from various locations of India, that how water crisis has emerged in India. Now, technically, this is basically an issue which all of you are already aware of. I don't see that anyone here would not be knowing about the water crisis. It is something which is a very evident issue around us. And to address the issue of water crisis, let us start with the discussion of this particular report. Of course, a single report can never be, it can never justify the entire topic. A single report can never justify with the entire strategies that are needed. But at least this is one step in the direction of knowing what is the crisis and also finding a possible solution to the crisis. So let us start with the findings of the report. So when you talk about this report on uh, high cost of cheap water, this report, to go further, I want to first talk about what all kind of opportunities this report has presented in front of us. I have taken most of the references from the report itself, so it is a detailed discussion of the report, in totality, and I'll be giving some examples, particularly from India, just to make it more relevant from UPSC point of view. So, in this particular report, they have given us, for the first time, they have talked about a global opportunity for developing unity, for taking up a united stand in protecting or conserving the water resources, in improving the water efficiency, and also in equitably distributing the water resource among the haves and have nots. It has talked about the recent disasters. The recent disasters, if you guys must have noticed, majority of the disasters, in fact, one third of all the recent disasters that we have noticed, they have been related to water. Sometimes there is excess of water, cloudburst, floods. You guys can easily relate it with the month of June and July, how the state of Himachal Pradesh in India has suffered with the severe floods. It has been an unprecedented levels of flood that the state has witnessed. Every year we witness similar kinds of floods, or similar kinds of floods in the state of Assam. Brahmaputra river floods every year. We also see similar kinds of floods nowadays in the urban areas as well. Bangalore has been one of the examples. We never heard of Bangalore getting flooded, but last year we saw the city of Bangalore getting flooded. Since 2015, the city of Chennai has been getting flooded almost every second year. City of Mumbai almost gets flooded every year. So this is, when you notice all the recent disasters, environmental or natural disasters, you would notice a third of them are routed around water crisis. Now, one third of the wetlands are basically areas where soil hydration is more than soil hydration is more than soil aeration throughout the year. They happen to be those areas which are temporarily or permanently maintaining an aquatic ecosystem. So it has a very broad definition for wetlands. If I consider the areas allocated under wetlands under the Ramsar Convention, so as per the Ramsar Convention, wetlands are something which can include lakes, rivers, oases, uh, not entire river, basically stretches of river, oasis, mangroves, corals, salt pans, then paddy fields, paddy fields. Then it may also include coral reefs have been covered, estuaries, right, etc. many of these things. So you can see that wetland itself is having a very wide definition. So we have noticed in the past 5 decades, in the past 50 years, one third of of the global wetlands have already vanished. They have been degraded, right? The freshwater species population, they have fallen by almost 83% on an average, according to the findings of this report. And this report also calls for an urgent action at the global level, at the local level, global, local, national, all these levels. They have asked for an urgent action, and they have also called for redefining the sense of water management and safeguard measures for the ecosystem. How eco-friendly dams, eco-friendly hydroelectricity usage has to be developed. How rechannelization of the river can be damaging. So, what could be the possible solutions in that area? What is the role at individual level? What is the role at institution level? What is the role at government level? All these things this report has talked about. So, let us talk about what all findings this reports have. Now, according to this report, they have basically divided the entire report on how different parameters, how different sections of the environment are being affected. So they have divided the report in terms of how societies are being affected by water, and how water crisis can further cause damages or can create further challenges or different other challenges in the societies. How economies are dependent on water, how ecosystem is dependent on water. So this report has highlighted three different sections: section 1, section 2, section 3. Section 1 talks about how societies are being affected, how societies will further be changing because of emerging water crisis, how economics how economies differently of economies are being affected by water crisis, how economies are dependent on water, and how the degradation of water quality is going to further damage the economies. It has talked about how ecosystems, the overall ecosystem value is being maintained through water. I hope you understand. Water is technically being, they have used the expression called lifeblood for the entire ecosystem, right? So they have mentioned the entire report under three sections. And then the fourth section, they have talked about what are the possible solutions, what are the possible actions that can be taken in addressing these crises. Now, the first point that I want to highlight here is, as of 2020, according to this report, almost 26% of the world's population still lacked access to safely managed drinking water. 26%, almost one fourth of the global population still lack access to safe drinking water. I hope you understand. It has already been mentioned in previous reports that India is one among the most water stressed countries. If I tell you the basic parameters on this, for India, the parameter is, we provide shelter to approximately 18% of the global population. 18% of the global population lives in India. And for 18% of the global population, approximately 4% of water, of global water, is available. So you guys can easily understand, India is one among the highest water stress countries. For 18% of the global population, only 4% global water reserve is available. If I go by the Falcon Mark Index, Falcon Mark Index basically talks about the ratio of water required for all the goods and services that the country needs, divided by the total renewable water available. It is the ratio of the water needed and the renewable water available, Falcon Mark Index. If I go by the Falcon Mark Index, on an average, we require around 1700 meter cube of water. For per capita water requirement should be 1700 meter cube. Annual water requirement, 1700 meter cube is the requirement of water annually for an ideal Falcon Mark Index. So on an ideal basis, every individual deserves this much of water annually. But when you talk about India, this is the data from Niti Aayog itself. In 2018 itself, Niti Aayog found out that in India, the current Falcon Mark Index is somewhere close to 1400 meter cube. 1400 meter cube. It is already falling short by 300 meter cube from the ideal levels. It is expected to further lower by 2030. By 2030, India's Falcon Mark Index is going to further lower to 1300 meter cube. And by 2050, it is expected to further lower to 1000 meter cube approximately. These are approximate values. 1000 meter cube. So almost half of the water that is technically out of the total water that is needed for a sustained lifestyle, for maintaining the minimum lifestyle, the water requirement should be 1700 meter cube. In India, it is going to fall short to 1000 meter cube by 2050. So this clearly shows that India is one among the most water stressed countries in the world. Now let us go on with this report further. Now this report also highlights that only one third of the large rivers are still free flowing, and the world has lost one third of its remaining wetlands. That I have already told you. In the past 5 decades, in the past 50 years, one third of our wetlands have already been lost, and only one third of our rivers in the world have been free flowing. When I talk about free flowing, there is a concept called eco flow or ecological flow, or you can say e flow, ecological flow or e flow of the river. The ecological flow of the river talks about the freely flowing movement of the river. See, I hope you understand this. When you consider a river flowing, when you consider the river freely flowing, you understand that river is not just running, moving water or running water. River, it is an entire ecosystem, guys. And this ecosystem has its own nature of cycling of the material, cycling of matter. It has its own nature of food chain. It has its own nature of purification of water from sediments. You guys must have noticed that if there is a village that is found at the adjoining a river, and suppose this river, these villagers, they start using exploit the water of the river. They start using this river water for cleaning purposes, for agriculture and such, and they eventually discharge some of the waste into the river. And if you let the river flow for another 50 kilometers, you would notice that the next village will not have any such contaminants found in the water. What would have happened to the contaminants in the passage? They would have either got deposited in the form of sediments, or they would have got accumulated by some living organisms. They would have converted them into some kind of calcium carbonate. They would have converted into some kind of biomass. Technically, the thing is that if you maintain the natural flow of the river, the natural ecosystem of the river will keep the river healthy. Healthy not only for the aquatic organism, but healthy for the entire ecosystem around which the river flows. I hope you guys can understand this. So around one third of the total rivers in the world are right now having a free flow, right? Majority of the rivers have been exploited for hydroelectricity, for diverting their waters for irrigation canal, for diverting their waters. Like in India also, there is an upcoming ambitious project of interlinking of rivers. So all these activities will also have some impact on the natural ecological flow. Water quality is also worsening. Agriculture runoff simply talks about how the nutrients, especially nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium based nutrients, when we put up in agriculture, a lot of these nutrients are not dissolved in the soil. They are not dissolved, they are not absorbed by the plants. Majority of them gets drained into the water body nearby, not just rivers but also to the stagnant water bodies, wetlands, due to use of fertilizers, pesticides, manure impacting surfaces, groundwater, and almost 80% of the wastewater is now being flowing untreated into the rivers or wetlands. 80% of the wastewater. In fact, this particular report also highlights an important point that modern engineering can never decouple society from its dependency on water. With modern engineering, we have been able to develop newer solutions. We are seeing that to run this AC, we don't realize that there is a consistent dependency on water to run this AC as well. Like for example, 60% of electricity in India is still 55% electricity is still being produced from coal, and this 55% electricity that is being produced from coal, you have to understand, for running the coal based power plant there is immense amount of water needed, because water is being used as a working fluid in a thermal power plant. Water is also being used as a cooling agent in a thermal power plant, and on top of that, water is also required for lot many transportation applications, right? So you guys can understand that modern engineering solutions cannot help us to completely decouple all the engineering marvels, all the developmental activities from the dependency on water. So this is something which this report has particularly highlighted. Now let us talk about this first section that the report has mentioned. The report in the first section has mentioned how the water dependency is high on societies, and how with increasing water crisis our societal balance is going to get affected. So these are some of the facts that I mentioned here that I have taken from the report itself. I don't think that reading all the facts is going to be very important, but it is important for you to highlight these facts whenever you're writing an answer in civil service exams. So I'll also be sharing this PPT along with the video, right? So right when the video gets uploaded, right when the video gets completed, I'll be sharing this PPT also, right? So over half of the world population already faces water shortages at least 1 month per year. I don't think there's a need to explain this part. And this figure could rise to around 5 billion or two-thirds of the global population by 2050. So over half of the global population are facing a problem of water crisis for at least 1 month every year. And this number can rise to 5 billion guys by 2050. Currently, the population of the earth or population of the world is around 8 billion and is expected to rise to somewhere close to 9 to 10 billion by 2050, right? And approximately by 11 billion by the end of this century. In fact, IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has already mentioned that 50% of our global population are expected to live under water crisis if the global temperature rise touches 2 degrees Celsius. If the rise in temperature, 50% of the population will fall into the bracket of water stressed. Limited availability of water in the region with high water scarcity is one of the major reasons. Increasing pollution of the major water sources such as river, lakes and aquifers due to fertilizers, chemicals and heavy metals, it is causing one of the biggest challenges. And there is a concept called WASH. WASH means access to access to clean drinking water, sanitation and hygiene. We use an abbreviation WASH for it. So approximately 2 billion people source drinking water directly from rivers. 2 billion people are directly dependent on river for their requirement of clean drinking water, sanitation and hygiene. It contributes somewhere close to 1.4 million preventable deaths each year. So just think about the importance here, guys. If we are able to manage safe drinking water and sanitation and hygiene, it can help us to prevent 1.4 million deaths every year. So you guys can understand that how strongly we have a link between access to safe drinking water and societal deaths, right? Deaths in society you can consider. In fact, waterborne diseases are also on the rise every year. In fact, this report finds out that there are approximately 443 million missed school days every year because of waterborne diseases. 443 million school days are being missed every year for globally because of waterborne diseases. So you guys can understand how the societal health directly depends on water scarcity and the quality of water. On top of that, you guys can also understand, it's not mentioned here, but it's mentioned in the report itself. See, water crisis directly affects society. Water crisis directly affects the gender inequality. Just to give you a small example, in India, you'll be surprised to know, this is as per the Niti Aayog's own data, that approximately 30% of the villages in India are still dependent on fetching the groundwater or river water. And you guys know that woman is mostly involved into fetching this water. So when woman itself is mostly involved into fetching this water, you guys can easily take a hint that if the river starts shrinking, if the groundwater table starts going lower and lower, the time it takes for fetching the water will increase. And if the women in the rural societies are spending majority of the time in just to arrange water for them, you guys can understand that they are losing an important essential component of the day's time, which could have ideally been used for some other lucrative purposes. You can actually link Sarv Shiksha Abhiyan, you can actually link other kinds of developmental activities in the time that the woman is spending just to fetch water from the river. You guys must have heard of the Jal Shakti Abhiyan, right? Or the Jal Jeevan Mission, by the way, right? Not the Jal Shakti Abhiyan. Jal Shakti Abhiyan is mostly for agriculture. This is Jal Jeevan Mission, which talks about supplying, access to potable drinking water at the household levels. Now, this is something which Government of India envisages. It will definitely have an impact on the societal levels, and it will have an impact on gender equality, gender parity levels. I hope you're able to understand. It is always the vulnerable section, guys, that is most affected whenever any crisis emerges, right? Then the section 2 talks about the impact that water crisis may have on the economies. So here I have covered the greater picture here from the economic perspective. So the first point says fresh water contributes to economic prosperities by powering industries, manufacturing, mining, technology, trade, energy, and agriculture production. I hope you understand that there is no industry technically on earth which can work without water resources, right? Agriculture, to point out, agriculture is probably the biggest market in the world. You guys can understand, nobody can live without food and agriculture. Nobody can live without food. So if you consider agriculture primarily just from the context of food, you guys can understand 8 billion consumers are there of this industry. 8 billion consumers are there for this particular industry of agriculture. So one can easily understand that how agriculture can be affected if any change in water availability happens. Even if you invest in drought resistant crops, they would still need some moisture in the soil. So soil can never afford to have zero moisture levels. Some water will still be required, but of course, investing in drought resistant varieties of crops will obviously be a better choice in that direction. So there are areas, almost every industry that we have, it is somewhat affected by water. I have given some facts. According to the WWF water risk filter, 10% of the global GDP comes from regions of high water risk. 10% of the global GDP comes from those regions which are at a high water risk, and it could rise up to 46% by 2050. So 46% of the global GDP will eventually be contributed by those countries from those areas where there is a high water risk. You guys can understand it will definitely have an impact on the socio-economic conditions in that region. Secondly, waterways. Waterways in India, national waterways are coming up. It is something that is expected to become a game-changing way of transportation. It can be an effective tool of transporting industrial goods from one place to another. China, for to give you an example, is using some of the very popular waterways. Europe has been already been supported by almost 50% of their entire trade happens through their inland waterways. You guys must have heard of the Rhine River in Europe, the Rhine River, and the Po River in Italy, Danube River. These are the kinds of river which are very popular in waterways. A similar kind of system can be effectively used in India, where we can use the natural decline, the natural run of the river to transfer goods from one place to another. But if the river catchment area decreases due to, if the river quality decreases, if the water level starts depleting, we'll of course see a downfall in this particular trade aspect. And you guys can understand it is like a vicious circle. If the water levels of the river falls, there would be more diversion, there would be more burden created on the land based transportation system, on rail based transportation system. And land based and rail based transportation system are mostly running on fossil fuels, and fossil fuel emissions will further release greenhouse gases that will cause even higher impact on climate change. And you guys can understand, with a greater impact of climate change, more and more water resource is going to shrink. So you can understand that it becomes a complete vicious circle, right, of water crisis. So waterways also serve as a vital connector between major port cities, coastal regions, and inland areas, enabling efficient transportation of goods. Almost 90% of the global power, yes, global power sector is another area how what this report highlights. If you consider 90% of the global power produced across the world, it is being produced through means like hydroelectricity, coal, and other kinds of resources which requires immense amount of water. I had just now mentioned that in India, almost 55% of the power is being produced from coal, and coal is effectively used for as a working fluid inside a thermal power plant. It is also used as a cooling agent for cooling down the entire coal-based power plant. On top of that, hydroelectricity power plants are also there, which also use a significant amount of water. I hope you guys can get this right. Almost 15% of global electricity production, accounts from hydroelectricity, and that is again one of the major source of water. More extreme floods also pose a growing threat to the safety of aging of vulnerable hydroelectric power plant. In fact, this gives us a different sight to understand this report. When you talk about natural disasters like floods, when you talk about natural disasters which are water driven, like what has happened quite recently in Sikkim, GLOF, glacial lake, you know what do you call glacial shale of GLOF, the event that happened in Sikkim. This is something, these are the kinds of events which are waterborne, and with more and more rampant, floods and such events, it will have a direct impact on the rigidity of the water of the hydrothermal power plant, hydroelectric power plant. It will if it will directly have an effect on aging water, aging dams. If there is a dam that has already aged, you guys must have heard of some of the dams in South India that are already close to 100 years old, and the overall integrity of the dam becomes questionable when during the crisis of floods and such events. So extreme floods and these events will also pose an even bigger threat on aging dams and their vulnerabilities. Almost 70% of the global fresh water is withdrawn from surface and groundwater sources. And you guys can understand, India is one among those countries. In fact, we are the most we are number one in terms of exploiting the groundwater resource. It is expected that 70% of the global fresh water already comes from surface and groundwater resources, and this is rising. This is going to increase by up to 90% in the coming years. And also, you can understand, as the dependency on groundwater increases, our overall availability and quality of groundwater also decreases, because as the water table goes down, the propensity of finding heavier elements, the propensity of finding dangerous elements will increase as the water level goes down. It will also affect the overall food production worldwide. It will also affect the overall irrigation water, and on top of that, with the higher percentage of heavier elements, it will directly affect the human health as well. So this was the second section of this report, which talks about the impact of. There are some few more points also. Unsustainable economic activities, that is also causing a degradation of freshwater ecosystem. Like here, there is a case study that they have mentioned on sand minings and dam construction on the Mekong River. Mekong River, I hope you understand, it is a river that of that it's considered as one of the lifelines of for the countries like Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, right? Mostly Vietnam, Cambodia, and Thailand, right? And it is a river that right now possess second largest fish biodiversity after the Amazon River. So it's a river which is very rich in aquatic ecosystem. It is very rich in the fish biodiversity, and on top of that, this river supports a rich, cultural heritage also of these countries. Now, right now, in the call for development, there are a lot of sand mining activities going on. Along with that, there are a lot of dam construction activities going on in the region. Now, sand is one of the cheapest and the most important one of the most important ingredients for any kind of civil construction work, right? It acts as an important water absorbing agent, right? Eventually improves the cementing properties of the concrete, right? So sand becomes an important part here, and this is where it is important that we have to somehow identify this issue of water crisis and how it directly gets affected due to activities like sand mining and dam construction. So dam construction, I have already told you about the ecological flow, e-flow of the river. Sand mining again becomes an even bigger threat, right? In fact, according to this report, more than 600 hectares of riverside and coastal land are lost annually due to erosion, and between 2018 to 2020, almost 1,800 houses in the Mekong Delta sank into the river or the sea. So almost 600 hectares of riverside of Mekong River has been lost, has been degraded, right? Due to the erosions, coastal erosion. And as you mine more and more sand, the integrity of the coast also gets more and more vulnerable, and it gets more vulnerable to erosion eventually. Now, in the report, they have also mentioned some preventive actions which can be applied in India as well. Delta wide sand mining budget should be made. According to the delta, how much of deposition of sand is there, we have to first allocate a budget that only this much of sand can be yielded out from those deltas. We can shift to M sand, manufactured sand. Manufactured sand is the one that is made from stone crushing. And thirdly, we can declare sand as a strategic resource. Strategic resource are basically those resources which are monitored directly by the government, and they are used only for strategic application. So you guys, you can understand that by declaring, by giving a strategic resource status to sand, it will come under direct supervision of the government, and it may be used only for some dedicated applications. Illegal mining can effectively be controlled by this. So these are some of the steps that talks about how the economic impact of water can be studied, and we have been able to assume this. Now, the third part of this report talks about how solutions towards water management, or how solutions towards uh, you know um, water can be identified. So here the first fact says that we have already lost one third of the world's remaining wetlands in the past 50 years. All of you understand this. It also talks about that freshwater species have already collapsed by 83% in the same 50 years period. This is the finding of the previous report of WWF. Now, to understand the strategies for protecting the wetlands, we have to first look at what role does wetlands play. Now, understand this, that wetlands play an immense role. It's not just limited to supporting an aquatic ecosystem. Of course, if I talk about the role of wetlands, it definitely supports a greater biodiversity, especially aquatic biodiversity. It also plays an important role in, there is a term used in ecology called ecotone. Ecotones are basically those areas which are mergers of two different ecosystems. Wetlands usually fall within the ecotone boundaries, and that is why they maintain a rich biodiversity. Wetlands also wetlands also play an important role as carbon sink. Carbon sink. Wetlands can effectively help in storing the biomass within the soil, can effectively keep the biomass intact without getting degraded. It effectively helps in promoting more and more sequestration of atmospheric carbon as well. In fact, just to give you a small idea here, there's a fact mentioned here, peatlands. Peatlands are basically those wetlands which have a high quantity of biomass. So peatlands store a huge amount of carbon already, more than twice as much as world's forest, despite of having just 3.4% of the global land area. So peatlands are basically those kind of wetlands which have a good reserve of biomass. They occupy just 3 to 4% of the global land area, but are responsible for storing more than twice the amount of carbon that the total forest cover of the country of the world stores. You guys can understand it can be an important carbon sink. So maintaining wetlands can be an important way of also preventing the impacts or mitigating the impacts of climate change. Then on top of that, wetlands also help in purification of water. Wetlands are famously considered as kidneys to the ecosystem, kidneys to the environment. So because they help in purifying the water, because of the sediment deposition on the wetlands, the surface water runs off, leaving the sediment there itself. The water quality gets better, it gets further purified. Wetlands can also effectively help for their recreational value. They can effectively help for their recreation value. You guys can understand the importance of wetlands on society and economy. On terms of their recreation value, it's also very important, right? When you go to a wetland, you will see multiple water bird species. You may see different types of animals, plants, and that will, of course, be adding on to the recreational value of the wetlands. So it can promote tourism, it can produce fishing, it can promote any other kind of activities related to this recreational value. I hope you guys can understand. Approximately one third of the vertebrate species, including more than half of all known fish species, are supported by freshwater habitats. So almost half of the fish species that we have, they are supported by freshwater habitats, guys. Next is the section 4. It talks about the impact that wetlands will, the kind of strategies that are needed to protect the wetlands. So here I have first mentioned one particular concept called water blindness. Water blindness is one issue that this report has widely mentioned. Blindness normally talks about, or it means lack of awareness or understanding of the diverse values of water. When you do not understand the various values that water holds for us. See, there could be some direct values of water, there could be some indirect values of water, or there could be some non-use values of water also. We'll talk about those values eventually. But when you are completely unaware of what value water has in your own survival, in the maintenance of the societies around us, in the maintenance of the economies around us, that event is known, or that particular state is known as water blindness. So this particular report mentions water blindness as one of the challenges, and this has to be eliminated, guys. We have to raise awareness at all levels, so that everyone is concerned, everyone is aware, and everyone is participating in managing water crisis. SDG 6. There is an initiative called Sustainable Development Goals. All of you might be aware of it. The sixth Sustainable Development Goals talks about clean water and sanitation. So Sustainable Development Goal 6 is one very important factor that has to be considered in order to make sure that all the strategies towards clean water and sanitation is met by all the countries in the world by taking up sustainable actions. Then water security and healthy freshwater ecosystems are also central to reducing hunger. You guys can understand it. This goes without saying. It is central to reducing hunger, poverty, inequality, and vulnerabilities to climate risk. I hope you guys can understand this easily because we have talked about how water scarcity can lead to the issues of gender sensitization, gender inequalities can lead to the issues of economic decline, how the various economies are dependent on it, and on top of that it will also be helpful in reducing hunger, right? Food production, food security. Now here the report has mentioned about the values, the use value of the water. So according to this report, there is an astonishing fact that they have shared, which says that the total use value of fresh water in the year 2021 is estimated to be 58 trillion US dollars. 58 trillion US dollar has been cited as the total use value of fresh water. 58 trillion US dollar is equivalent to 60% of the global GDP. 60% of the global GDP. Just to give you a figure here, if you look at China's GDP, according to this report, China's GDP has been 17.7 trillion US dollar. This is China's GDP. And this figure is somewhere close to 3 times of the total GDP of China. 3 times of the total GDP. So China having the second largest GDP, this figure is 3 times of the total GDP of China. So this much is the value that fresh water has in terms of monetary numbers in the year 2021. And I hope you understand this value is further going to increase because our dependency is widening, our dependency is increasing, and the quality of water is getting depleted. So according to this report, they have divided the values of water into various parameters. The first is direct use value. Direct use value is basically talking about how we see a tangible benefits of the use of water. Like for example, when you talk about water supply to the household, there is a tangible use of water. We use water in cooking, we use water in bathing, sanitation. It's a tangible use. So this becomes a direct value of water. When you talk about industrial and agriculture purposes, direct value. There are a lot of production process that involves water. There are a lot of agriculture process that involves water. Without water, agriculture cannot be performed. Recreational value, like I mentioned this already, right? Freshwater fishing, hydropower generation, these are all use value of water, direct use value of water. So when you talk about direct use value, out of the total value, almost 7.5 trillion, almost 7.5 trillion of this total value is accounted by direct use value. So this much of water we have been consuming directly, and it is showing direct results in front of us. Direct use applications are being shown, and 7.5 trillion US dollar is the total value of this direct use. By the way, India's GDP is somewhere close to 3.5 trillion US dollar. You guys can easily do a comparison that this is still more than double of India's GDP. Agriculture stands out as the largest consumer of direct use value, accounting for almost 70% of the direct use value globally. Of course, you guys can understand why agriculture. Remember, when I say agriculture here, it also includes the production of fertilizers, pesticides, because these industries also are immensely dependent on water supply, fertilizers and pesticides. When you talk about indirect use values of water, indirect use values of water talks about the individuals and societies which derive the use of water by services like water purification, flood regulation. Now you guys understand that rivers, wetlands, they help in managing the floods. Like when you talk about the role of wetlands, wetlands play an important role as floodplains. Whenever there is excessive water levels in the river, they often, the water gets often dispersed into the catchment areas around floodplains around the river, which helps in protecting the entire human settlement from getting flooded. So first the floodplains are going to get filled, and then only if the water levels further rises, then only there is a risk on the human settlements, right? So this is the another value of water, which is the indirect value of water. Like I said, carbon sequestration, quality of water. It includes biodiversity maintenance, cultural and spiritual value. Now according to this report, this is the value of water that accounts for almost 50 trillion US dollars. This value is something that is providing us 50 trillion, of economic value annually. 50 trillion of economic value annually this has. Now, how do you quantify this? See, this report itself has acknowledged that it is almost impossible to find the real value of water. But if you consider the value of water in terms of floodplains, flood regulations, you guys know that the city of Chennai and Bangalore are very good examples that how encroachment in the floodplains have caused the recent floodings in the two cities. We have never heard of Bangalore getting flooded previously. But in 2022, this flood became so massive that everyone started talking about how the poor urban planning in the region has caused this particular flood. We have been listening to this, we have been finding same news on Chennai since the year 2015. How the poor planning, poor urban settlements, the entire encroachment of the floodplains, all these factors have led to the crisis that we saw, that we have been witnessing for the last 7 8 years. And this loss that we witness because of the poor urbanization and poor policy planning, this has accounted for 50 trillion US dollars annually. This is annual value, guys. I hope you guys can understand that for a country like India, which is still, having a fraction of this value in it as its GDP, is going to be heavily stressed due to these kind of activities. Then non-use values basically includes things like mental and physical health. The kind of satisfaction when you go around, around a water reserve, right? The kind of the feeling of awe that you feel when you go around a river, around a healthy lake, when you see different kinds of vegetations, plants, and different kinds of animals living around that region. All these things, they are considered to be the non-use value. They have not been able to quantify this non-use value because it is technically impossible for us to figure out how much, what kind of sense of transcendence you feel when you go under or go around a water body. Then there is some option value also. Option value talks about preserving and maintenance of the potential future of water. This has also not been accounted for as in this report. So mostly it is direct and indirect value that they have accounted, and this concludes somewhere around 58 trillion US dollar. According to this report, the key threats that they have identified for water crisis are overexploitation of water resource, climate change, destruction and degradation of habitats. This is another factor that has caused excessive freshwater reserve threats to the freshwater reserve. Invasive species. Invasive species are basically those species, guys, which are mostly non-native. I'm saying mostly non-native, and once they are introduced in a new ecosystem, then sometimes if they do not have a natural predator, or sometimes if they start competing with a local species for a similar resource, so these kind of species, if they are made to compete or if their natural predator is missing, they sometimes starts dominating in the region, and this dominance eventually harms the other native species of plants, animals both, and such kind of species are known as invasive species. Now in the garb of interlinking of rivers, in the garb of global trade, there is more and more influx of invasive species in different water bodies. You guys might have heard of water hyacinth. It is a non-native variety of plant in India. It was brought in by the Britishers for beautification purposes, but now it has become a threat to majority of the water bodies in India. You might have also heard quite recently there was a news of hydrilla. Hydrilla is a it's an aquatic plant that has recently been found in USA, in Michigan state, which is considered to be one of the most invasive plants in that ecosystem, right? You must have also heard of some other plants growing in the water bodies. For example, water hyacinth is ecornia also, right? We also call it ecornia, right? Um, so hydrilla, water hyacinth, all these kind of factors are there, which happens to be causing damages. And apart from this, there are some other invasive species which may be derived from water to plant or plant to water, and eventually may cause threats for the local species. Like some invasive species may start growing over water bodies, and eventually they may affect the dissolved oxygen levels of the water. It may eventually reduce the amount of a dissolved oxygen level for other aquatic species in the water bodies. Then another factor is water pollution, flow modification, and fragmentation. Now this is where I want to talk about interlinking of rivers. In India, this interlinking of river has become a very popular initiative from government of India. It is also considered to be a highly ambitious project which is meant for managing droughts, providing water for agriculture, and at the same time, you know uh, mitigate the impacts of climate change on our water quality. So the idea on paper appears to be very good, because it says that wherever we have excess of water, we can put that excess flood water into that area where there is droughts or where there is lack of water. So this idea appears to be very good. It can help in better agriculture, water available for agriculture. It can also help in better maintenance of floods. All these things can easily be maintained. But according to this report, they have taken the example of Rio Grande or Rio Bravo from Mexico. This is a river system that has dried up because of extensive exploitation due to anthropogenic activities. I'm not saying that this becomes a direct criticism to the interlinking river, but this obviously becomes one approach of understanding the impacts that river diversification, changing its exploitative nature, and also overexploitation can cause. So they have found out that the Rio Grande and Rio Bravo is drying up due to the extensive and heavily managed anthropogenic water withdrawals that are exacerbated by climate change activities. They have been threatened due to excessive dam construction on these rivers, river diversion and aquifer depletion, withdrawal, agriculture water withdrawal, with agriculture water playing a disproportionate role in driving the water over extraction. So basically, there are three factors which has caused this particular crisis. One is the excessive construction of dam in the region. Second is excessive withdrawal of fresh water for agriculture. And third is the overall diversification of water and the aquifer depletion that has caused major challenges to this river system. In fact, in the year 2022, there were some patches of this river that went completely dry. Now, WWF has recommended some actions here. The first action that they have recommended is that store degraded ecosystem and protect the native species of the water and the nearby areas. So that means it is protecting the native species against invasive species and such. Free up the water for the river by adapting agriculture to water availability and by developing local adaptation plans to reduce water use. Mind my words, guys, the local adaptation plans, they work effectively. Even in India, they have been initiatives at the local level which have been able to prevent water crisis, and also there have been examples where the local people have been able to grow or recreate the lost rivers, the lost wetlands. There is a very good example that comes from the Bundelkhand region where the local people's initiative, they came up with this initiative called Jal Saheli, where women were asked to become responsible in managing the water. And you guys can understand, when a woman becomes responsible to manage the water, the entire family has to manage the water in accordance. In accordance. So this initiative was so popular, so successful, that in the Bundelkhand region, we have been able to recreate a river which was lost around decades ago, right? So it is the local people's support that has been able to reverse this. So developing local adaptation plans to reduce water use, and lastly, reoperate dams to reshape the flow regime. So we have to start building dams in a much more eco-friendly manner. We have to start reoperating the dams so that the river flow has to be should be diverted only at the time where it does not harm the natural flow of the river. It doesn't harm the native varieties of plants and animals in the river. All these kind of things should be taken. So this becomes one case study that can be a good point of view to also analyze the interlinking of rivers. And then salt water intrusion, disease outbreaks, these are the other threats that we have seen under for freshwater reserve bodies. Now, lastly, after this, they have talked about what all possible strategies that can be adopted at different levels to handle the crisis of to handle the water crisis across the world. So, according to this report, they have identified these crisis, these actions at different levels. At government and governance level, they have mentioned that all countries should adhere to the freshwater challenge. What is freshwater challenge, guys? Freshwater challenge is a United Nations environment program led initiative. This challenge has been promoted in the year 2023. It's a part of current affairs, and according to this challenge, United Nations have asked countries to accept this challenge, and the overall objective of this challenge is to conserve and bring 3 lakh kilometers of rivers and 350 million hectares of wetlands under restoration by 2030. So United Nations Environment Program has called all countries to take up this challenge, and whatever they can project their own objectives here. Although the total plan is to conserve 3 lakh kilometers of rivers and 350 million hectares of wetlands. They should be restored by 2030. Remember, a similar kind of objective have also been taken under the Global Biodiversity Framework of United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, UNCBD. It was introduced last year in 2022. This framework also talks about protecting 30% of the earth by 2030. So wetlands, rivers, corals, they should be protected. They should be declared as a protected area by 2030, 30% of the world. Then there's another initiative called C40 collision. C40 collision is a collision of 100 mayors of the cities. So they are basically 100 leading cities. They have taken 100 leading cities of the world, and the 100 mayors of those cities have joined together under the C40 collision. And this C40 collision recognizes the role of freshwater management for climate action, for climate adaptation, and they also recognize the importance of how climate change impact is going to cause further degradation of the quality of life in their cities. So C40 collision has come up just with an objective of finding methods of maintaining and running the cities in much more conducive manner for the environment, or from climate change point of view. So they also acknowledge this freshwater management idea, right? C40 collision. Then lastly, sustainable development goal number 6, like I already mentioned, this should be adopted by most of the countries. Developing flexible and locally tailored water allocation system to ensure fair, sustainable distribution across sectors. Sustainably manage and protect groundwater resource. This is another important aspect. If you look at from the Indian context, in India we have got something called Atal Bhujal Yojana. It is a scheme that is meant for replenishment of the groundwater levels. So this is one scheme from Indian context that can be considered here. Nature-based solutions to increase natural water retention and strengthen the resilience, and end harmful subsidies. This is an important part, guys. Harmful subsidies. You guys understand that government of India or state governments, in particular, they give subsidies on various things. Just to point out, one of the factor is that is subsidies on electricity. So when you supply electricity at subsidized rates to the rural households, it becomes very obvious that electricity is cheaply available for them. So when they put up any kind of pumping system to fetch water from the canal into their agricultural fields, what will happen? The entire electric pump is going to be running for much longer period, because the farmers don't have to worry about paying for that electricity, and this entire water can be easily drained and can eventually be drained into the rivers, into the agricultural fields, and from the rivers into the agricultural fields, from the canals into the agricultural fields. And then by flooding the entire agricultural field is not going to solve the problem of agriculture. It will not improve the quality of the yield, but because of the subsidized electricity, more and more water extraction can be seen, and we will be seeing more of this water being extracted. We'll be seeing more of this water being wasted as well due to such kind of subsidies. So WWF have also called at the government level to end all these subsidies which are technically harmful to the nature, right? Apart from that, there are also subsidies on urea, subsidies on pesticides, which also cause similar impacts, right, on water requirement. Then for industries and businesses, they have mentioned that they should disclose their water risk assessment, how much of their activities are causing quality or depletion in the quality of water, depletion in the levels of water. Implement water saving technologies, minimize wastewater generation, and maximize efficiency. Simple points that one can easily understand. Then for financial institutions, they have called for dedicating 50% of all the public finance that they have for adaptation purposes. Adaptation purposes or adaptation activities are those which helps us adapt against a crisis. Like say for example, if there is a water crisis coming up, so suppose if there is a new institution being set up in India to develop those varieties of crops which are less water demanding, they are drought resistant varieties. So that would be a way of maintaining food security without dependency on water, or without much dependency on water. So this becomes a technique of adapting against the water crisis. So adaptations includes all those techniques, all those initiatives that can help us in better preparedness against an upcoming crisis. So 50% of the fund should be kept for adaptation purposes. Then for civil societies, the role that they have mentioned is to raise awareness and advocate for actions. For individuals, they have asked for educating the peer groups, promote mindful consumption. Like it is quite obvious that consuming vegetarian food is always better than consuming non-vegetarian food, just to consider the water crisis, because the amount of water required for vegetarian food is much less compared to what is needs for non-vegetarian food. Taking the kinds of goods that you have, like say for example, if you are using a furniture which has been grown from which has been taken from a wood that involves high amount of water consumption, then in that case that furniture will also have a much higher water footprint. Uska water consumption will be very high. So you can take smart choices, and depending on what kind of wood one should use, what kind of clothes one should wear, what kind of different equipments you should be using, so that the water requirement for creating those equipments can be checked and it should be minimized. I hope you guys can understand. And advocate for for change at work. So individuals can obviously advocate for bringing changes in their work culture, changes in their offices, so that the water stress that is being created by these organizations can be minimized and made more efficient. So these are the issues that have been taken under the high cost of cheap water report. I have covered this report quite extensively. You guys can re-watch this particular video, and to know more about this report, to know more about this water stress, please let us know in the comment. I'll be happy to make another video on the overall water stress of India and the overall situation here. Thank you.